Hello, this is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess. And I actually had minor surgery yesterday.
Oh wow, what happened?
I had an infected cyst, which was cut and drained yesterday.
Good Lord.
Exciting. So while we haven't been here because Ben's been traveling, I've also been intermittently sick with an infection. So it's all worked out in a way by not working out.
Fair enough. I should say, by the way, that on TIR we did somehow end up with two versions of this that are both streaming right now. It looks like.
Really?
So,
Because I was like, surely the problem will resolve because a YouTube channel can't stream twice.
well, maybe it's not. I mean, it looks like it is where I am, but yeah, who
Oh no,
knows?
yeah, no. Look, I have on my list. This is Revolution Podcast 9 viewers. This is Revolution Podcast 1 viewer.
Yeah,
I guess
okay.
it doesn't really matter.
I suppose, yeah, kind of. I don't know. Maybe later Jason can go through and delete the duplicate.
Well, I mean, that's fascinating. Like, I never would have thought that a YouTube channel could stream two videos at the same time. Maybe it's a new feature, which is now why everything's screwed up. That's usually how it goes with no new YouTube features.
Oh yeah, fair enough. I mean, I would just. I mean, I've got the back end access. I mean, I would just delete one right now, but I'm too worried that I'd delete the one that the more that more people are watching, not the one that almost
Cut the
nobody's
red
watching.
wire, Ben. Cut the red wire.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm not going to cut any wires. We're just gonna let all this go.
Yeah,
By
if,
the
if if your chat is not having posts in it, you're probably one of the people who are in the isolated section.
There you
So
go.
if you are, click on the other one. Or you don't care about chat and you just care about me and Ben, in which case, stay where
Yeah,
you are. Don't
well,
worry
stay
about
where
it.
you are. It's fine. Yeah. Uh, yeah. So in any case, I should say, by the way, because I was meaning to say this at some point in today's stream, and I might as well do it now. That if you enjoy the artwork on the Substack,
Mm.
um, I would.
Do you have the link, Ben? Do you want to put it in the private?
I have the
What
link.
website was it on actually? Because it's the last URL I went to on that website.
It's
So I
on.
probably
It's on GoFundMe. I just put the link in the private chat.
okay.
So if you enjoy the artwork on the Substack, so that is made by our friend J. Andrew World, who also does the artwork on my show and also about 10,000 other things that don't involve me. But most importantly, those first two. And in any case, he also does lots of stuff for bands and other podcasts and whatnot. But his necessarily, given the change in technology, the only way for him to do a lot of the art that he does for us, and certainly all the art he does for the Substack, is on an iPad. His iPad broke, and he needs a new one, and it's just not. Let me tell you what. I think the money he's getting from GTAA is not as expansive as it would be in a better world. And so he started a GoFundMe to replace his iPad. So I think we now have So we put it in the chat, and we'll go through and make sure that link is added to the description. Also, even for the dud version of this, it's probably going to get deleted.
There are currently 3 people in the legally dud one. Oh no, it's 8-6 now apparently.
Oh, okay, all right.
So
Yeah,
people are just
competition.
50-50.
Competition.
I think because we haven't seen the thing is, I think the message, if there was another one, it would come. It was blue in the chat. I think it's fake. But anyway, let's go on. Today we're going to be talking about socialism.
We are indeed going to be talking about socialism. What's that?
I liked your article this week because there weren't any 1,000-word segments about a taxi driver or anything.
I don't think there was. So wait a second. Do you mean the one that came out this week, or the
Sorry, I mean the one that we're discussing today.
Yeah. Yeah, I
It
don't
was
think
all
there's.
it was very tightly focused.
I don't
I
think
did,
there's
I did,
anything about a taxi in any of them. I mean, like in.
the taxi was the mold bug one, which was relevant. I'm just making fun of
Yeah, I
people.
mean, it wasn't really a diversion. It was more just like, here's some stuff that he said that seems relevant. But yeah, fair enough. So, but yeah, this Mike Beggs one is definitely one of the ones where the self-imposed 3,000 word limit was probably helpful because
I
it
mean, you
was
managed to say a lot in those words, I thought.
definitely a struggle to stay inside it. But yeah, fair enough.
There is a game, Ben, called Victoria 3, which I
Okay.
think I've described to you before, which was I was reminded at various points through this article, because in Victoria 3, you manage a country from 1836 to 1936, and you try and develop its economy into a modern capitalist state. That's the inevitable fate of all countries, apart from all countries which then develop to some kind of early stage of socialism.
Right.
But one really annoying thing about imposing, like, it's nice to have free market capitalism in this game because then you, the player, don't have to manage everything. But you can also impose kind of a cooperative model of economics where the pops own the kind of the normal people own the buildings which exist, and then all the capitalists and aristocrats are made unemployed.
Yeah.
But it's actually not actually very fun to have a cooperative model of ownership because these pops who own these buildings, unlike capitalists, they don't invest their money. They just spend their money on cars.
Right.
They spend their money on consumer goods, which is obviously good for the economy, but it means that the government or I mean the banks or whatever, the government, the state has to then tax them and then spend their money in order to expand the economy, which I was reminded of so much when I was reading your article today.
Yeah. I've played Pac-Man. Haven't played Victoria 3. Can't speak to that. Oh, and Ms. Pac-Man.
You should talk to Gene about it. It's a great game.
Sure.
The most Marxist video game.
Yeah. No,
Um,
this is the most culturally non-standard thing about me as a American white dude of my generation that I've just essentially never played video games.
I mean, good for you. It gives a lot more time to read books and so on and so on. They are ultimately probably not the lowest form of entertainment. They're probably actually, I think they're probably better than actually watching TV because at least you're not completely passive. But they're down there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably better for you mentally than TV, but it's probably one of many things that exist now that,
But it is more asocial compared to TV because I mean the best
right.
way to watch TV is to watch TV with friends and then not really watch the TV but to watch your friends.
Yeah. Uh,
But the
fair
kind of
enough.
question that was pressing upon me reading the article, which you don't go into,
Sure.
but it's fine because you go into lots of things in the article. And talking about this will then go into the stuff in the article without just repeating the
Yep.
content in there. Is what is a market anyway, and what is a socialism? So
Sure.
especially in terms of like are markets like are markets something which is fundamentally driven by prices?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the kind of and the relationship between kind of socialism and proletarian self-management, because quite a
Sure.
lot of the stuff described, I was thinking like you know socialism can't merely be proletarian self-management because we can imagine a society which is basically identical to ours in its political economy, apart from we get rid of the bosses class and say take all the profits that the bosses class would have, and then invest that into pension funds instead, but otherwise have an identical political economy. And that's not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that's at all likely, but it's entirely possible, I think. But then it seemed basically that someone that you quoted, not the main guy, basically advocated for this,
Oh, John Romer.
who seemed to, reject like
Yeah.
workers' democracy and so on and so on.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think there are a bunch of stuff going on in those questions, but, probably the question that I, find the least interesting out of all of those is what's a market, because I know that there are economic theorists who have like incredibly broad definitions of what counts as a market. So it just sort of becomes tautological that you can't get rid of markets. It's like, okay, fine, but like that's not really what we're asking, right? When we ask these questions about,
Right. We're not like they were barter markets for a very long time, but we're presumably
yeah,
not talking about barter markets because barter markets are just not something which anyone like. Even if there was some kind of people would say like if the evil communists abolished money, people would just engage in barter, and like maybe they would to some degree, but you just couldn't really do it. Like for the stuff that there's no way to really
it would,
exchange the complex things that we have.
like you could imagine a moneyless economy that ended up having essentially, for all practical purposes, like essentially like a sort of vast barter market for like resale, right? But which in fact, I'm sure that would exist in some form, right? But it wouldn't be like the bartering really wouldn't be carrying out the sort of most important economic coordination tasks in that society, right? I mean, it just I think that's probably true. So I think that however broadly you want to define the parameters of what counts as a market, I think that when we're thinking about the sort of interesting questions about capitalism and socialism and market socialism and planning and all that stuff, I think we all kind of know what we mean by market. In other words, that, certainly, because, I don't really know anybody who says, oh, we probably do need to retain some market mechanisms, but it's going to be some kind of wacky market without money. I mean, I guess like maybe Paul Cockshod in a weird way, but like, that's but mostly I think that's not really what people are saying, right? I think usually when people say, oh, we need to completely get rid of markets or it's not socialism, or then other people respond, no, I don't think we can do that. I don't think we know how to do that yet, but we can, here's a form of socialism that would still have a role for markets. I think everybody kind of knows what everybody else means by markets in that conversation, right? Like in other words, that you're doing, so Mike Beggs, who's the guy who I'm talking about in this essay, right? He wrote an essay for Catalyst called the Market and Workplace Democracy and a Democratic Socialism, that was later reprinted in Jacobin. I do not remember what it was called in Jacobin, but if you just look up Mike Beggs Jacobin, you'll certainly find it. And so Beggs in the article, I mean, he even kind of, I think, knowing that he's going to trigger people like you and combining words like this, right? He even uses the phrase socialist commodity production.
Oh no, that's good. That's just to make things straightforward and clear and obvious. Like that's great.
Yeah. So, in other words, like I think generally speaking, when we talk about markets in this kind of context, right, what we're talking about is the, production of goods for sale, which theoretically, essentially the same thing could happen without money. In fact, that's kind of an argument Marx makes early in Capital, but also like, for all practical purposes, no, it couldn't, right? You really couldn't have like mass exchange going on at that level, without the mediation of money. It would just be way too clunky. So,
Yeah, I mean, everyone would have to expend their full hours like transporting the goods back and forth to here and to there, such that it seems impossible for anyone to then produce the goods.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it'd be incredibly inefficient, right? At best, assuming that there's even a scenario where this is functional at all. But yeah, so I think that I think there are a few different ways of thinking about this, right? But I would say, so yeah, when we're talking about markets, we're talking about stuff like that, right? That there's stuff. Now, which stuff it is going to be very different on different, models of, hypothetical political economy, but there's some sort of stuff that's being produced to be sold for money, right? And then socialism, I would say is, even more contested than market is, but but I think socialism, means social ownership of the means of production. So that rather than the means of production, being owned by owned by private individuals who then employ people to work there, or rather than one of the sort of kinds of ownership and control relationships you had in various kind of pre-capitalist class societies, that workers or broader communities or a combination of the two own the means of production, and I'd say that definition is one. It's useful for our purposes here because it doesn't pre-decide the issue. It's neutral, with regard to whether there's money in some market mechanisms, and um, and I think that I'd also note, right, for people who are and this is also, I'm always a little bit awkward about how to like broach this part because I don't really want to encourage people to be like fundamentalists about Marx, because I think that you should actually just like go about trying to decide what you think is true, and if you agree with him, great. If you disagree with him, great. So some of each, great. But I would point out for fellow Marx nerds in the audience, right, that whereas Marx very clearly assumes that commodity production will cease along with capitalist property relations. That's true. When he's, Marx doesn't go around giving you definitions of terms usually, because why would he do that? But when he is referring to socialism, what we think of as socialist future, almost invariably the way he refers to it is in a way that's like along the lines of the definition I just gave. Right, the society of associated producers, stuff like that, right?
I mean, this is interesting, right? Because it presumably implies that while the Soviet Union obviously had commodity production, uh, whether they had social ownership of the means of production is at least ambiguous, and certainly a large part of it was formerly owned by workers, while the rest was owned by the state and so on. Which means Ben thinks the Soviet Union is much more socialist than Stefan does.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, I've kind of given up on this years ago. So if you read my first book, you'll see me like actually taking some effort to defend the like that doesn't count as socialism line. But I've sort of given up on that over the years, and said like I mean I even kind of said this in the first book, but like since then I've like really gone over to just being like, look. Maybe there's a sense in which it is, or, if it's socialism, it's certainly not the kind of socialism I advocate, etc. Right.
Right, because, like, it's not like capitalists defend every kind of capitalism. I mean, they really,
Right.
it seems more or less that they never defend any actually existing capitalism normally.
Yeah. There's a weird combination. Like oftentimes I think they go back and forth, sometimes even in the same paragraph or the same sentence, between, true capitalism has never been tried, and look at all the wonderful things capitalism has done for us.
Yeah, when the first farmer exchanged the first seed of grain with another farmer, that was capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, it doesn't currently exist in the US. It's just a status illusion.
Right. Yeah, I should say exactly that. If you want to, and there is actually, like, I'm glad you broached this issue about the Soviet Union, because even though it's not what I was talking about in this essay, it has always been interesting to me that there is this parallel between, what used to be called an old-fashioned Trotskyist speak, the Russian question, right? Like what to say about the class nature of the Soviet Union, and the market socialism question, right? Like that in that there's, whether people say one or the other, would count as socialism. I mean, I think the shape of those debates are different, but I think they do parallel each other in interesting ways. And it's like helpful.
Right, and the kind of the things advocated in the article you wrote, I think, are not kind of. I mean, I think they're more similar to the Soviet Union than our current economy is.
In certain respects, yeah. I mean, look, I think that certainly, and this is one of the reasons that market socialism is sometimes, an unhelpful or misleading term, that certainly there's a vastly bigger role for state planning in this model, right? And it's just that you don't, it's just that they, and to a certain extent, right, this does mean a contraction of the market, right? That there's,
Right.
you know
Market socialism means demanding less market than we currently have.
yes,
Just
exactly,
just
right.
more market than zero.
Yeah, exactly. More than zero market, precisely, right? That's what the adjective market means in market socialism, which is perhaps, as I said, a bit misleading, right? I mean, it's like if you're that, I don't know. I mean, if you're advocating some some form of, libertarianism where you're almost, where you're like dramatically reducing the state, but then, okay, should, sure, maybe we need the police and fire department. Say, oh, okay, so we'll call this view state yesism, right? That's yeah, it's a little bit misleading. I mean, so like, okay, somebody, my friend Lee Phillips is probably the person I know who I have, you know, I don't want to offensively say, my favorite, critic of market socialism, because you're right here in the Zoom, in the, restream with me, but the person who I've talked about it with the most, right, who I think, who I find most, compelling on this point, right? Like, and, you know, like the sort of thing that he'll say, in fact, I think he did say when we were talking about this after this essay came out, is okay, sure, there's inequality, there's exploitation, there's workplace domination, right? But like all of these things are downstream of certain kind of like market anarchy, and I actually think there's a sense in which that's true. But it's, that again, I mean, I think even social democracy involves, some considerable curtailment of the prerogatives of the market. And if you win all the way to abolishing capitalist property relations and, and instituting, social ownership, other means of production, that'd be like a really dramatic curtailment of it. And yeah, I mean, there's this, I think there's a sense in which I wouldn't disagree with that, but the question is, so there's one way of asking the question, which is like, does this even count as socialism question? And, I'm certainly happy to entertain that and, to argue about that. But then, there's also, maybe a slightly different question, which is like, okay, putting aside what we should call it,
Would it
right?
be nice?
Right. Yeah. Is this something that we should be excited about? Is this, does this connect, with our reasons for being socialists in the first place? And, and then a third closely related way to have the conversation is to say, okay, let's say that the answer to the second question is, I don't know, I could be more excited by it. Fair enough. Then an obvious follow-up question is, okay, well, look, if you've got an alternative that would, remedy those features of it by virtue of which you could be more excited about it, man, I'm all ears.
Right, because reading the article, I was genuinely getting the impression of these things sound nice, but they don't really sound like socialism. Um, Revolving around the fact that it wasn't just kind of that, obviously commodity production is there, but it seems as if kind of the kind of the structure, apart from being democratized, was the same. Um, in terms of like it wasn't
Yeah.
just commodity production, but commodity production with not just a state, but like a really big state, which has like banks and so on. But yeah, the question is kind of what is the alternative to that, and kind of it gets into questions of like what relationship with production and consumption do we want to have? Because you can obviously be critical of saying, like, this kind of structure which incentivizes more and more production and expansion and so on. But if we aren't degrowthers, which is
Right.
a point me and Lee Phillips and you
Yeah.
obviously agree on, then, and as pointed out in the article, it seems quite hard to incentivize within even this kind of structure, which I'm saying might
Right.
not be socialism, but it's nice, how to incentivize kind of expansive production. And if we're getting into conditions of kind of commodity abolition and abolition of the state, then that seems incredibly difficult. So it's not kind of clear, if we imagine the kind of the classic Marxist kind of understanding of socialism, of the kind
Yeah.
of lower stage of socialism and higher stage of socialism,
Yep.
how you could ever possibly get from the lower stage to the higher stage, unless that doesn't involve an expansion in production, is something which is definitely unclear to me, and often leads me to think, well, maybe it'll never happen. But obviously, the lower stage of social, if the socialism described in this article are nice, the lower stage of socialism as described by Marx is very, very nice, and I'm not particularly worried. If we didn't actually get to full
Right.
communism, I'm really fine with that.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that, right? Like, I think that, uh, yeah. Look, so my view on this, and I suppose at some point we should tell people. I mean, look, I'd like to believe everybody did the homework before they tuned into the stream, but at some point we should probably tell people, what the model is.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I was planning to transition at one point, but then you said something, I got distracted.
yeah, fair enough. So yeah. Um, So Mike Beggs is is an economist in Australia. He's actually, like, I don't know, I guess universities there still have this name, so it's kind of neat. Like, technically speaking, I think he's a professor of political economy. That's the name of the department.
Neat.
But in any case, and in this Catalyst article that I'm talking about here, uh, and in the book that Mike and I and Bhaskar Sankara are getting tantalizingly close to finishing someday. Then the model is okay. We have having society being divided between a class of workers and a class of capitalists seems very bad for all sorts of reasons that I suspect I don't need to convince most people watching the stream of. Uh, but uh, but then the obvious question is, if that's not going to be the case, right? What's the alternative? And it's funny, actually. So for anybody who read the essay that came out today, I sort of briefly mentioned this argument that very late Rawls makes, where he sort of finally admits at the bitter end of his career, like earlier on, he'd been like, in Theory of Justice, he's agnostic about capitalism versus socialism. He says, oh, that's an improvement. And at the very end of his life, he finally acknowledges that capitalism really does not require you to meet his requirements of justice. They said, but even there, he's still too squishy to just say, okay, therefore socialism. And so what Rawls gives is this disjunction that's like, okay, either you can have socialism, or you can have what he calls property owning democracy, which is incredibly vague, but seems to mean that ownership
Because
is.
when he says property owning democracy, it makes me think of, like, Athens,
Yeah, right.
like the most extensive slave society in history.
Yeah, which presumably he does not want. So I think what he means is that somehow or another, the ownership of the means of production aren't collectivized, but it's rather diffused, so widely throughout the population that there really isn't like a class of propertyless workers anymore. As far as I can tell, like I said, this is me guessing, because he doesn't really explain himself. And of course, I think in some ways, right? I mean, there are sort of normative socialist ways you could object to Rawls about that, but I think the sort of historical materialist point to make about this would be like, okay, look, even if we even if we accept that in theory these would both be good, only one of them is on the agenda as an actual historical possibility, right? Because this is more or less the way Marx ends chapter 32 of Capital, that says he's just finished describing this horrific process of expropriation of the English peasantry, and then he says, "Look, obviously there's no turning the wheel back." Right? That's like,
The only way is through, based.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, we can't go back to a society of smallholders, but we can go forward to the expropriation of the expropriators. So if you see that as the basic mission statement, that we're expropriating the property of the capitalist class and having some form of collective ownership, then the next question is, well, okay, we did that already in the Soviet Union and many other countries. And you can argue that the Soviet Union doesn't count as socialist, consistent with the definition I gave. I'm not particularly interested in making that argument, but you could take the kind of line that like James Conley takes, that like, state ownership counts as socialism to the extent that, the working class owns the state. Right. But in any case, putting that aside, it doesn't really seem like the problems with the Soviet economy can all be blamed on lack of democracy. It seems like, yeah, look, I'm sure that in a more democratic version of the Soviet Union, they would have, like the worst things that happened in that system wouldn't have happened. Stalin, if Stalin had to worry about winning, the Ukraine in the next election, right? Then
Probably the Great Purge wouldn't have happened, or it would have been a lot less purgy. But it's not really clear how it would change, like the economic crises of the 80s.
Yeah, totally right. It just doesn't seem like the sort of day-to-day frustrations of Soviet consumers, like
it seems you get into like an economic tailspin. Cooperative ownership and kind of strong democracy is probably going to like lock you more into that tailspin than like some big state which can take like radical measures to get you out of it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that certainly whatever else is true, like it seems like the problems with the Soviet economy don't seem to, like, it's not obvious, like whether or not you think it would make it worse, it's definitely not obvious that democracy would have made it better, like, or at least significantly better, because, certainly if you try, just as like, I always like to think about this just as a quick thought experiment, like, okay, imagine a version of the Soviet Union with free speech and multi-party elections, and maybe, whatever party gets the majority to form a government and appoint the head of Goshplan, right, to plan the economy, right? It doesn't seem like there's anything about what I just described that would have made them better at the sort of basic economic coordination problems the Soviet system was bad at. Which is to say, coordinating production priorities with like fine-grained consumer needs, and having and even sort of efficiently allocating capital goods, and like these seem to be the sort of, I mean, it's not a very exciting story, right? But I think it is a true one, right? Like these seem to have been the things that model was really bad at. And I think that those of us who want to have another go at it, the whole expropriating the capitalist class thing, kind of owe everybody else an explanation of why the same thing will happen this time. And so, in service of that, yeah, the model that's suggested is one that, both, tries to take on both obviously the lack of democracy in the Soviet system, but also the, the sort of sources of the most like crippling economic inefficiencies in that system, by saying, okay, well, one thing you can do is, if it turns out that, to solve these kinds of calculation problems, you do still need a private or quasi-private sector of commodity producing firms, these can at least be worker-owned firms. But then you said something really interesting earlier. You said that, okay, we could sort of imagine like changing nothing but that, right? And I think it's sort of true that we can imagine that, but I have a really hard time imagining it lasting for more than 5 minutes.
Yeah,
If
the point was like I was doing philosophy. I was making a point in
uh,
principle that this is
about
possible,
whether it meets the
and
definition, yeah,
thus these two things can't be identical. Proletarian
right.
self-management and socialism are distinct, at least in principle.
Um, yeah, I mean, self-management is an interesting phrase, but maybe I'm being too pedantic now. So that's because people also use that to describe things that happen within capitalist ownership, really. But whatever, I know what you mean, right? Workplace democracy, right? So yeah, if you change nothing except to change the ownership of every existing firm, to like transfer the ownership of every existing firm into the hands of workers, then the problem, and as like a lot of, as I'm sure somebody like Lee would point out, right, the obvious problem is that look, in the churn of market competition, some firms are going to be more successful than others. Some are going to go out of business. In fact, honestly, that itself is a feature, right? Because that was one of the main problems with the Soviet economy, that they didn't really have a mechanism for firm failure. So there's a lot of
Yeah,
like
like
real,
we want firms which don't work to not exist or change
yeah,
rapidly in
exactly,
order
right, to have this
to
incentive to
become good.
change, so they can keep in existence or whatever. Yeah, totally, right. Um, so yeah, some firms are more successful than others go out of business, and you change nothing but this, then it seems like, look, even if you asked a magical genie, here's my wish, right? That they have, the genie, you found the genie in the lamp right after you finished reading Richard Wolff's, book, about democracy at work, right? I said, okay, your wish is that all of the existing firms are going to be transformed into worker-owned collectives, but nothing else is going to change. Then yeah, as some of them in the churn of market competition are less efficient than others, they go out of business. Then you suddenly have people who are desperate enough that they would be willing to take on jobs as wage laborers, and you have a incentive for the more successful firms to take people on that way, right? So Mondragon, for example, in real life, is this famous giant cooperative in the Basque Country in Spain, and says especially beyond the Basque Country, they all have taken people on, right, as wage laborers rather than members, because they're responding to this incentive with from the way that the current setup works, right? So I know that was a lot of buildup. So just as quickly as I can, right? Like the suggestion is uh, that you have, as with lots of socialist models, the commanding heights of the economy are state owned. So that's certainly stuff like transportation, energy, broadband, etc. And I think crucially for the model, finance, and then for firms putting out consumer goods, that we think that you do still, if you do still need to have some you do still need to have commodity producing firms that can fail and all that stuff, to produce consumer goods. Then those can be worker-owned collectives. And crucially, the way to start a new collective or to expand an old one is to get grants from publicly owned banks. So as a matter of policy, that could only could only get one of these grant. Like um, traditional capitalist firms need not apply, right? You can only get one of these grants given worker ownership, and then there are a lot of bells and whistles in how it's a Mike gets into in my essay, sort of presenting in a less technical way than he does the gist of his essay. But crucially, it's the worker owners, right? So if you're in the firm, it's not like the ownership of the means of production is no longer for sale, right? There isn't that kind of market anymore, right? rather, your vote within the firm is something is like.
I like that. It's kind of so contrary in some sense to Marx's definition, in the sense of like we sell commodities and we only sell commodities.
Yeah. So your vote in the firm is like my vote in Los Angeles City Council elections, right? I get it when I move there, and I lose it when I move out, right?
We need to support the Texan LA diaspora in expressing their preferences for California.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that, and then the workers are the residual claimants on firm revenues. So essentially, how this would work is that the state, like with these state grants that work like loans, but you only have to pay off the the interest, not the principal. It's what it amounts to, right? It is essentially the state owns the physical means of production and rents them out to worker collectives. The sort of rate of that rent can also vary, which can address concerns about places where you can get sector to sector inequalities and things like that. And quite a bit of the article is spent on responding to concerns from the right. In other words, to like reasons that economists might have for worrying that even in this kind of socialism, you wouldn't get the incentives that you want, that you'd have perverse incentives, etc. Right?
I mean, as a proud Dengist, I did also have a lot of these right-wing concerns.
Yeah.
Fair it is to be expansive and to spend money and reinvest and so on and so on.
Yeah. So this is right, and all of that is funneled through the state sector, right? So and yeah, this is so I think Mike has a lot of smart things to say about sort of how to address those concerns about perverse incentives and a lot of that stuff, right? So because I think his primary goal and mine in presenting it is to establish, okay, there is a way that you could expropriate the capitalist class, have collective ownership of the means of production, and still have a thriving modern economy, right? Rather than having the kind of dysfunction that you had in the Soviet model, right?
And avoiding like intensive self-exploitation.
Exactly, yeah. And whether that phrase even makes sense exactly or not is a whole other thing. But you could even say, even if you think, because even if you think it doesn't, right, then like you could certainly say, yeah, but come on, you know what I mean, right? And I think that's sort of fair, right? It's like, yeah, I kind of do know what you mean, right? Like that you don't want everybody in the society to just having to be like run themselves ragged all the time and defer consumption and all that stuff for the sake of hustling to make their daily bread. And in fact, this maybe is a good way to transition us to the like, why might it nevertheless be the case that a deeper form of socialism would be more desirable in the long term, right? Because look, I think that there are reasonable answers to these questions, but I think those reasonable answers take the form of over what we've got in all these respects. But even so, like thinking about that concern about self-exploitation, that if you're just like running yourself ragged all the time, like like I do right in my real life right now, right? Then I mean, I think there is a fair point here, right? That like, okay, look, a big part of the point of the socialist project is precisely that people's lives should not be dominated by their economic lives. Even sort of basic reformist stuff like the workers' movement has always fought for shorter weeks, but like in the long term, I mean, you were talking about the transition from the sort of lower phase of communism and critique of the Goethe program to the higher phase. like, and I agree with you that it's, look, whether or not that sort of higher phase, there's so much superabundance that like all these questions about distribution sort of become beside the point. Whether or not we're ever going to quite get that, it's at least the case that the closer we get to that, the better off we are. Right. I mean, that's clearly true, right? That the less people have to work, right? The more you can spread around whatever tasks still need to be done, the better, right? That's definitely true. So, the way I would see this, and the essay does start by pretty hard on for economic planning, right? Just to kind of like remind left-wing readers there is a real problem here to be grappled with. But the point, as I see it, of the project isn't to say, here's as far as we can go, here's where history stops, I don't want anything beyond that, right? Yeah. The point of the project is to say, hey, it's
to convince people that read Jacobin who might not be on board to be on board.
Yeah, convince people who might read Jacobin because they like the advocacy for social democratic reforms, and they sort of share the general antipathy towards normie liberals and all that stuff, but who might not really believe, as lots of people who want to believe this don't really believe, right, that anything beyond capitalism is possible at all, right? That they think that this, as much as they might want to, right? I mean, even there's a reason why even so many of the leading politicians who might use the word socialist in the world today never actually talk about socialism, right? They only talk about the problems with what we have right now, or the sort of reforms they advocate, right? But they don't talk about socialism after capitalism. And I don't think that's because they're all sellouts. I think that that's because after the experiences of the 21st century, a lot of people just lost the faith that there is something there, right? That there is like a possible way of organizing society past this. And that's what I really want to convince people of, that it's like, yeah, we can have we don't need a class of private capitalists. We can have collective ownership of the means of production. And if you've got like a well thought out proposal for like, hey, here's how we could have a even stage one critique of the Gotha program society, and here's exactly how it would work, right? Then great, right? I'm listening. But I do think that that's a lot harder than a lot of socialists realize, to like actually like get a convincing account of how that would work. I think that I think it sort of seems easier the less time you actually spend thinking about it.
I was just thinking now that it's kind of there's a certain contradiction in writing cookbooks for the future as a socialist.
Yeah.
So I agree that's perfectly fine for Mike Begg to do it, but I think it might have been for the best that Marx didn't. Because if Marx had written a cookbook for the future, Lenin would have tried to do it.
That's very true, actually.
Like he would have really tried his best to do, because he was a very orthodox Marxist, apart from his great edition of Imperialism, in its importance of structure to capitalism. But otherwise, he was a very, very orthodox Marxist, and he would have just loyally done what Marx had suggested, which probably would have been wildly inappropriate for the real conditions of Russia.
Oh my God! I mean, look, I think that there's in the conditions of Russia. Well, look, I mean, Lenin started out as an orthodox enough Marxist to be perfectly aware that Russia couldn't leapfrog from semi-feudalism to socialism without borrowing somebody else's industrial base through the revolution spreading to the West. And then, when everybody was surprised that the revolution survived but did not spread to the West, right? That was like the one outcome that like nobody thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
Then,
it's like the narrow bronze path.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because it's like, yeah, everybody thought it would either be defeated in Russia or it would spread to the West. So yeah, when it turned out it was on that path, then I think he kind of tried to make the best of it, with the NEP and like the kind of thing that he was saying.
And importing, like, trying to import American capitalism without importing American capitalism.
Yeah, totally. And if you read like one of the last things he wrote is an essay called like On Cooperation, where he says that that basically he endorses what would later become Bucharianism, right? That there's that like, we should, it's like in the long run, we'll like slowly incentivize like rural, collective farms, but like it's, you get the sense reading it, he thought this was going to be like a 50-year process. And yeah, which is like maybe not great and not that plausible. I suspect that if Bukharin had won the faction fights in the 1920s, maybe the Soviet Union in the long term would not have been that socialist, but it also probably, if it sort of became Sweden with nukes, that would probably be like the least bad thing.
The problem is, I think Stalin in our timeline got really lucky, not in the sense that he won out against who he won out against, but rather by the enemy he faced from 1939 to 1945.
Right.
Because him having faced the industrial might of not just like a capitalist country who's trying to destroy the revolution, but the worst capitalist entity ever to exist, who wanted to exterminate the Jewish and most of the non-Jewish population of the Soviet Union, really basically backwardly legitimated his process of crash industrialization. While if Bukharin had come in and not done that, and events had developed similarly, because maybe they wouldn't, and maybe Bukharin would have formed a proper alliance with the French, and the whole situation didn't happen. But if Operation Barbarossa had happened against
they would have lost,
then the Holocaust would have succeeded.
Yeah, and right, yeah. I think that again, a lot of ifs leading up to that, right? Maybe Bukharin wouldn't have done the third period, and would have had a better chance of fending off Hitler in the first place. Maybe would have done the alliance with the French, etc. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the way things actually played out certainly did as much as anything possibly could have to legitimate the crash industrialization and also just give the system some political legitimacy in general, because my God, look at how much worse it could get, which is also I think the product to a great extent of I mean, the Hitler and his closest associates just being just like really, 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 really deranged ideological fanatics, because you'd even have all these like lower level Nazi officials in Eastern Europe be like, I don't know if we kind of treated some of them, like they were human beings, that like maybe we could like pacify some of these insurgents, that it's like, nope, we're not doing that. Like this is, I read a little while ago, what's his name? William Shearer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And, it's one of the things that like really came through to me from that book, that like the way we, it's like, okay, it wasn't particularly fun as like a non-Jewish French person to live under the Nazi occupation of France. That was bad in many ways. Right. But, that was just into thing from the Nazi occupation of, Eastern Europe, because,
the occupations in Netherlands and Belgium and France didn't get really bad till towards the end of the war, where the Germans started like running out of food and so on because of the war that was going on against them.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, it's like, yeah, obviously, the Nazis were willing to brutally crush, partisans everywhere, and et cetera, but it's like they basically thought French people were human beings, and they basically did not think Slavs were, so yeah, there you have it, right? So yeah, I think it sort of worked out to Stalin's benefit there ultimately, but
I would say to what Sam said here, that the Soviet positioning as dictated by Stalin in 1941 is, on the other hand, Stalin's greatest crime.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's
like, a man is so much more than the Great Purge or whatever, to the sense that it
right, the actual utilitarian effects of it, right, were much worse. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, it's funny since everything we've just been talking about the ways that the way World War II went did so much to ideologically legitimate Stalin's position.
Yeah.
But like also if we're calling balls and strikes, like my God, this man has so much responsibility for how that turned out through, you know, everything.
Really being the only man who believed that the Germans weren't going to invade the Soviet Union.
Yeah, being the only man who thought they weren't going to invade the Soviet Union, you know, killing or sending to the gulags, you know, so many of his best generals, who I mean, literally like had to be rescued from there when, you know, Operation Barbarossa started in some cases to, you know, to bring them back to the front, through the disastrous Comintern policy that, you know, that whether or not, you know, that enabled Hitler's rise in the first place, that, you know, I mean, whether or not a smarter strategy would have stopped him, like certainly that one is like the stupidest thing you could have done, you know, like through etc. Right. I mean, there's like lots and lots and lots of ways that, you know, Stalin is responsible for exactly how much of a disaster it was. But nevertheless, I think in the ways that sort of mattered for like, you know, giving the system ideological legitimation, you know, it worked out for him. But, you know, in some ways that, you know, to take us back to where we were is actually the particularly damning thing in terms of the flaws in the economic model, because, you know, obviously Stalin was way more of a monster than any of the Soviet leaders who came after him. But, you know, I don't know, maybe like Beria for 5 seconds, you know, was worse, but like, you know, that's, but
yeah, people like all of anti-communism seems to be based on the idea that like every year in the Soviet Union was like the Great Purge,
right, exactly.
while every other year was actually kind of like a dull authoritarian government which gave you a free house.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the like there's that always bothered me, like that's one of the reasons the Chernobyl show bothered me, besides the fact that you know, of course, right? Because I don't know, there's got to be some sort of political insult that covers why I would think this, but I am actually extremely pro nuclear energy. But you know, beyond that, right? I you know, it's like, you know, just the way they'd like show people being like casually shot and stuff like that. It's like, come on, man, it's the 80s.
Like 1985 in the Soviet Union.
Like, this really wasn't going on.
After World War II, like during the Stalinist period, like the Banderite like insurgency in Ukraine, they didn't even mostly get shot.
Yeah, I mean,
They got sent. They got like 8 years in prison and released after 4. Like, do you know who organized that? Who went really soft on the Banderites? It was Beria.
Interested, yeah. Well, you know, it's the man had a real knack for being wrong about everything in one direction or another. But,
yeah, liberal in exactly the wrong ways.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, but it's like, look, so everybody after Stalin, way less of a monster than Stalin was. And, you know, like even before Gorbachev, I mean, like, you know, by the early 80s, I mean, even by the 70s, like it's not, you know, yeah, they'd like retrenched and become a little bit more authoritarian since the Khrushchev thaw, but like it, you know, the Soviet Union, whereas obviously, you know, they didn't have free speech and etc. Right. But like, you know, it was much less monstrously authoritarian when it really ran to ground. Right. You know, than obviously it was in its worst period. And, you know, that, which tells me, you know, I think is some reason to suspect that, you know, that wasn't the only problem, right, you know, with that system, right? You know,
right. For every year of Stalinism, the Soviet Union existed. Well, for every year of whatever you want to call Gorbachevism, which is obviously that was their attempt at market socialism, right?
Yeah.
And they did impose initially this cooperative system in the Soviet Union.
Sort of, yes. Yeah, I mean, the problem, so if you read, what's that Zubov book, Collapse? I don't know if you've seen that. That's, which definitely one of the things I got out of it was that as good as his intentions may have been initially, Gorbachev was just a massive fuck up that like this emerges from like every page of that book. But I think that the problem with, you know, you know, the glasnost and perestroika, you know, in that era when they were doing the economic reforms, is that it was kind of neither fish nor fowl. In other words, that they didn't have a lot of the traditional state oversight mechanisms, but also they didn't give people any meaningful incentive not to just like rob the system blind.
Yeah.
Right. So, it was kind
Yeah,
of pretty.
and then they basically went, "Oh fuck it, we'll just have capitalism," and then it went to absolute hell.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Which
So,
was obviously really helped by all the kind of American grimmer worm tongues that invited in.
yes, exactly. And so, yeah, I think that, I mean, in some ways, I think, and also the national, like encouraging, like decentralization of the nationalities was like a giant disaster in ways that I think should be obvious now. But yeah.
Ukraine is made up, but it was made up by Lenin, so I have to stand.
Look, all nations are made up, right? There's never been a non-made up nation, and there never will be. But I think that I think encouraging this sort of centrifugal forces, with it, like within within the state, like hardcore nationalism is really bad news. In all sorts of obvious ways, and certainly if they were going to try to maintain their own economic bloc in some form, right? That would have required a stronger center. But I also think in some ways that okay, so if just ignoring for a second the core problems of the economic model, just thinking about Soviet authoritarianism, I think my take now, actually, when Gorbachev died, I wrote like a very sympathetic obituary of him for Jacobin. But I think my take now would actually be that if one aspect of the danger of how much power was concentrated in one person at the top of the system, like one illustration of that was Stalin, another illustration was actually Gorbachev, right? That it's like it just has some like extremely half-baked ideas about how economic reform could work.
Yeah.
And he could just kind of do it, because he's in the he's in the top slot. It was
like an incredibly kind of like undemocratic approach to try and introduce democracy.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it ended up being a disaster, right? Because you can't have, if you're going to have firms operating more autonomously, state you have to let them go out of business, right? Like that's or else like the incentives are just going to be insane. And, that's more or less what he ended up with. And then by the time it was clear how badly it was working, all the grim and worm tongues, were in place. And, the rest is history, but, I'd like to not, do that again. Right. Like, I think that, and, in some ways, I think that you couldn't, I think that a lot of Western leftists really underestimate the degree to which the sort of day-to-day frustrations of Soviet citizens as consumers were a huge factor in the dissatisfaction that led to the system's collapse. Right? You'll notice that as dystopian as the collapse of the Soviet Union was, right? It's like, and I do want to be clear on that. Like, it was terrible. It's I'm in the weird position here of being an anti-Stalinist who thinks the collapse of the USSR was a world historic tragedy. But as terrible as it was, you'll also notice that hey, where was the workers' revolution to save the workers' state, right? That. What does that tell us, right? That it never materialized, right? That by and large,
I mean, people did fight relatively hard in the 90s, but yeah, they didn't no one went to war.
Yeah, certainly nobody went to war. There just wasn't.
Yeah, like if say the 1994 election was directly rigged by the United States against the Russian Communist Party, that didn't lend to the Russian Communist Party, the Russian people being like, no, actually, the communists won. People
Yeah,
just went, oh, fuck it.
and it's also not clear that the Russian Communist Party in 1994 actually wanted to go back to the
Oh,
fully.
definitely not. But like,
Yeah,
I assume the voters of it were expressing a desire to be like, I really hate the past 3 years.
sure, yeah, but again, it's just like the fact that initially uh, the population was by and large willing
Yeah,
to, you know,
the process was greeting with optimism, and then it turned out horribly.
right, exactly. But the fact that it was initially green with optimism should
Yeah,
tell you something, right? Like
yeah,
that's a really important data point.
yeah.
That and I think if you want to explain why it was green with optimism, I think that those day-to-day frustrations of Soviet citizens as consumers are actually a really important part of that story.
Were bread lines real? And if so, why were there bread lines? Like, I don't really understand why there could possibly be bread lines. Like, was it just they didn't have enough kind of shop consumer staff? Like, was it? It seems contingent at
I
least.
suspect that breadlines is a bit of a telephone gaming of what they had. That that it's that probably when like some, I mean, I don't know, maybe somebody can correct me on this in the chat, but my guess, right? The Zubov book doesn't mention this, at least in the part I read, but the my guess is that bread lines is sort of a telephone gaming of like, yeah, sometimes people probably lined up at stores that had things that nobody else had in stock and etc.
Right.
Right. That like, and probably this happened kind of a lot because of the, patchiness and, of the system. So yeah, I
Yeah, I
don't
guess
think,
maybe bread lines like before they opened or something. The problem is just me like they weren't so stupid that if some place consistently had like a big line that they wouldn't just hire more shopkeepers, especially because shops in the Soviet Union were one of the few bits of market socialism. Like shops were normally worker owned.
yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I think the issue is like that where the goods,
Yeah.
uh, at the shops, came
Yeah,
from. And,
but if
the
you've
to-
got not enough goods but can hire people, then you don't have bread lines because you just run out and you tell everyone to fuck off.
yeah, yeah,
Which is
yeah,
a
yeah.
big problem of its own, but it doesn't produce lines.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I suspect that people are like standing in line, you know, like in the sense that like people might stand in line for like Black Friday deals,
Yeah.
or like when like hot new tech products are released or whatever, right? I think in that same sense, people might have often stood in lines for mundane consumer goods just because there were weird shortages, and so like whoever had them, right? That would get would get like too many people at once trying to go there, but I don't actually know. But yeah, I think that we, you know, you know, I think that yeah, I think that if you want to say yes, we should try again, with collective ownership of the means of production, I think you do have to have a good explanation of why you're not going to run into similar problems at the level of the basic economic model. Now, if you want to say that, I think that the even better thing would be just not having market mechanisms at all, right? That there's no commodity production at all, right? Which is certainly uh, yeah, in some ways is a deeper historical change because you certainly had commodity production before you had capitalism. But yeah, they have, but there's no commodity production at all. There's no money that then uh, I think that there are reasons to think that if you have a sort of logistically viable way of doing that, that would be better. That certainly, certainly it's better in terms of egalitarianism, because, you don't, because you've eliminated, because if, that's the only way you could probably completely eliminate sector to sector, firm to firm inequalities. It's better, I think, on grounds of democracy, because you have a wider sphere of stakeholders, who are deciding on production decisions. It's better in terms of that fuzzy but very real stuff that we talked about before, as far as the idea of like community as a socialist value. right? I think it's better on all those grounds, right? But and that does give us some reason, insofar as we can kind of figure out ways of completely decommodifying entire sectors to do so, right? Uh, but I also think that it's a mistake to just stop at, well, such and such would be nice, and I don't know, I'm sure we'll figure it out, right?
Yeah, no, like I think it's. I mean, it was fun reading the article. So at least in kind of utilitarian way, it seems good to make these plans.
Fair enough.
I asked a Soviet friend, "Were Soviet bread lines real in any way?" He said, "Yes, but no. Depends when and where, and what do you mean by a line." But
Yeah,
then he
that
said
sounds
there
about
were
right.
there were no mass checkouts, so in a small outlet you had to wait to pick up and pay. But that he never experienced anything close to a bread line because bakeries existed everywhere and baking factories had off sale windows.
It
Um,
actually, it also strikes me that bread
so I
might
think
actually.
the bread lines were the least common kind of line because I think
Right,
bread was
right, right,
everywhere.
right, 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 right. Yeah, that makes sense. Which actually makes sense if you think about it, because like a grocery store is dependent on the goods being supplied, by the state enterprises, and of course there's the sort of classic problem that there's really no feedback loop, for consumer preferences in any particularly meaningful way there. Whereas the bakery, I mean, they're, I mean, presumably, if in a bakery, you're baking the bread right there on the premises, right? So
Yeah.
like, assuming that Goshplan can at least get it together to get you enough yeast, right? Then you should be good.
Yeah. Like, yeah, it seems hard to fuck up bread, and I think they didn't. And then there's also confusion. We talked about like everything being the Great Purges. People also take it as if the Soviet Union was constantly in famine,
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed to having lots and lots of food from every point from like 1955 onwards. Like that was definitely electronics, stuff like that, immense problems. Bread, things like that, not.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to talk about the economic dysfunctionality, I think they ended up having to import a lot of wheat from abroad and et cetera, right? But
Yeah, they made sure they had enough though.
yeah, but they did actually get it together to make sure that nobody was starving, certainly, right
Yeah.
after World War II. Yeah, and that's always the thing about this stuff. It's like, you can't. So much of the discussion of what these countries were like is this like nonstop, incredibly stupid debate between people who think that people who think that this was actually like a really wonderful form of socialism, that everything worked great, and
Oh,
what are you
because
talking
there'll
about,
be some people who are like,
and
if
people who think that
you
it was like Narnia before Aslan, always winter and never Christmas.
if people really will say like, if you think if you don't support living in the Soviet Union during a famine period during the Great Purge, then you don't act. Then that was real socialism. You don't believe it, and then there'll be tanky style people who go like, yes, actually, I would have loved to live
uh,
in southern Russia during the famine period during the Great Purges because I'm a
right.
local.
Right. Whereas it's just like, I don't know. It seems like the boring truth is that these are like complicated societies that had a lot of problems, and there's a lot of stuff you wouldn't want to recreate, but like also it just wasn't like a hellish dystopia, like every minute of the experience.
Yeah. Great. What are you writing next week? I mean, we might do what if is
Yeah.
it been 3 weeks of socialism? 3 weeks of socialism
It
in
actually has been
one
3 weeks.
pen.
It actually has been 3 weeks of socialism. Since, yeah, I did. There was 1 week that I didn't write something, and then so it's been like 5 weeks since I would simply not be hungry. It's been like 5 weeks since there was a non-socialism one, because I did. There's the Mike Beggs one we're talking about today, and then I wrote one about capital last week, and then I was planning on moving on and doing something non-socialism this week, but then there's this Joseph Heath is a Canadian philosopher. Is this Joseph Heath essay that was like getting all this traction online. That was like a little bit too on the nose for like the central interests of the Substack not to do something about. So I talked about that today. And in a way, I think it's actually kind of I don't know. I think all three do kind of go together, but yeah, whatever next week is about, it's gonna, I do in general try to alternate between sort of more general philosophy topics and the Marxier stuff. And I've really gotten away from that in the last month. So, it's, I don't know, man. I mean, maybe maybe I could write something about, proper names as definite descriptions or something.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we need we need analytic metaphysics stat before we become normies.
Exactly.
Normie leftist online podcast.
Exactly.
We need to keep people guessing. Wow. So many background images. Okay, I'm gonna play the outro. Bye everyone.